Hello, and thank you for joining me. Today we will be discussing the communication efforts of American Airlines after a collision this past January 2025. First, I would like to start off by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land. We acknowledge the waterways, the land, the sky, and all who inhabit this country. We acknowledge their ancestors and elders and recognize those who continue to protect and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. We acknowledge the past and stand together for our future. So today's discussion and analysis of communication efforts around a crisis will focus on the collision between the American Airlines passenger airplane and the USA military Black Hawk helicopter. I will look at and analyze the communication efforts of the airline primarily in alignment with the popular theoretical models of crisis communication from Bridges in 2004 and discuss the key lessons and overall implications. I will also address the communication of the Trump administration in regards to those same theoretical models. First, it is important to establish the definition of a crisis and how it meets the criteria of what happened. As defined in the textbook by Tony Jacques, 2014, a crisis is an event or development that can focus unwanted visibility on the organization and is likely to endanger health or the environment, or seriously impact reputation or ability to do business, and leaves high potential for adverse impact beyond the initial event. So that leads us into what happened. On January 29, 2025, an American Airlines regional jet collided mid-air with a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter over the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. The American Airlines jet was attempting to land at the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport when collided with the Black Hawk helicopter at 278 feet in the air. 67 people died, all crew members and passengers aboard both aircrafts. This does fit the earlier definition of a crisis, as it is an event that will have unwanted visibility on the airline and the government and has established a danger to health and environment and will have a serious impact on reputation as well as business. So, to better understand the response of American Airlines, let's break up the communication efforts into a timeline. At 8:47 p.m. on January 29, 2025, the collision occurred. Just shortly after that, at 10 p.m., American Airlines released a brief statement to the public disclosing what happened, letting people know they would continue to update with new information as it became available. At 10:55 p.m., CEO Robert Esom releases a video explaining pertinent information regarding search and rescue and hotline information for families. On January 30th, at 4 p.m., Esom releases another video further updating American airline response efforts to this crisis, reiterating their commitment to helping the families of those who'd been aboard the flight. On January 31st at 2:45 p.m., Esom released an additional statement thanking President Trump and his administration for their action on aviation safety after the incident. The final statement was on March 11th after the Secretary of Transportation press conference, where Esom stated final thoughts. So, we are going to analyze the company statements a bit more closely using these popular theoretical models. The systems theory, where an organization is part of a system and all stakeholders can affect the organization in some way. The powerful stakeholder theory, communication of an issue might prioritize those stakeholders that have significant influence over concerns, but really it's just all about the relationships between the organization and the stakeholders. The legitimacy gap theory, where issues can come from the discrepancies between an organization's behavior and the public's expectations. Rhetorical analysis, words have different meanings to people, and those words ultimately shape the understanding and solutions. And of course, the social exchange theory, when both parties gain mutual benefits from negotiation. So now that we have an understanding of what we're using to analyze the communication, let's dive right in. The following statements I have on the slides occurred at 3 different times at 3 different press statements from American Airlines. We can see here the overarching themes of the responses are the well-being of crew, passengers, and families of those on board, as well as the cooperation and work with other stakeholders in the aftermath of the collision. We can really see the use of the legitimacy gap theory here, where American Airlines is attempting to regain the public trust. They are reassuring the public that their expectations of them align with the behavior of the organization, attempting to rebuild that trust and their relationship. We can also see some of the systems theory application here. American Airlines is communicating their efforts to work collaboratively with everyone involved after the collision. It's also really important to look closely at the rhetoric used in these statements. The phrases like, "we express deep sorrow," "we are all hurting," "we continue to mourn," and "this tragic accident" help shape the story for the public. These choice of words were selected carefully. A study from Schoofs and Clayton's 2021 found that organizations that express sadness over an event have a much greater reputational outcome. However, early in the communication of the event, the public strongly needs clarity or they will lack trust and find the organization to hold less competence around crisis management and events like it. That's why we can see these statements are scattered throughout each press conference and release, but that they are mainly detailing important information around the event and the work that American Airlines is doing to offset the outcome of the crisis. Additionally here, American Airlines and CEO Robert Easom said in many different statements released to please call the 1-800-679-8215 number if anyone had concerns that a loved one was on the flight. Here, I believe we can see that again, American Airlines is trying to rebuild that relationship with the public. So we're looking through a legitimacy gap theory lens. I also think American Airlines wants to be engaged with the public in order to restore some trust and some faith in the company. And I do think that aligns a bit with the social exchange theory. It is in no way a negotiation and definitely not mutual gain after the crisis that occurred and the lives that are lost. But I do think they're trying to give something to the public, this hotline, in order to receive something, the trust of the public and the faith of the public. So here I've popped on this slide the last statement that was made, released on March 11th after the Secretary of Transportation press conference. And I do think we can see here how powerful stakeholder theory is being used. The USA military is a very powerful stakeholder in the US government in general. So the message is prioritizing the relationship with that stakeholder by thanking them and reinforcing that ongoing relationship. And we can also see that rhetorical analysis here, a very careful choice of words to convey that sadness, but also show that level of competency that the public needs to see. So, other rhetoric. As I stated, prior news organizations mainly focused on the responsibility of the military, especially after the report was released that said the Black Hawk helicopter was not following protocol by flying above 200 feet. The Trump administration did have a press conference after the collision where they addressed the accident, the responsibility, and future implications, such as safety measures with transportation agencies. One main point people took away from the press conference was that President Trump seemed to place blame on other organizations or individuals. He stated that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at the Federal Aviation Administration were to blame for the accident. He also stated that the pilot of the helicopter was not competent at flying, as he has a helicopter. He stated at the conference, you can stop a helicopter very quickly. It had the ability to go up or down, it had the ability to turn, and the turn it made was not the correct turn, obviously. Looking at this response through the lens of the powerful stakeholder theory, we are not seeing prioritization of any stakeholders here, just the reputation of the administration itself. If we look at it through the legitimacy gap theory, we don't see the Trump administration valuing the relationship with the public or even the military at this point, as he criticizes a deceased pilot. This really alienated the public, especially the rhetoric used around his own helicopters and how easy it is to fly. There was a lack of compassion for the lives lost during that incident, and that really alienated the public. So, more so, how did the public respond? Overall, relatively very well to the American Airlines communication efforts. Most of the negative rhetoric was around the Black Hawk's helicopter and the Trump administration press releases. There was a report, again, indicating the helicopter was flying higher than they're supposed to, and that's why the collision occurred. Many news outlets actually had positive things to say about American Airlines response efforts, focusing on their empathy, timeliness, and of course, their many statements educating the public as much as they could. Twitter users had negative things to say about the US military efforts, Trump response administrations, but few comments around American Airlines response efforts and their involvement in the collision were negative. There are some key findings that can be taken away from this particular case study, as we can see, based on analysis of the communication efforts. American Airlines handled the crisis very well. The public appreciated the timeliness and effort of the communication. We can see a large portion of the responses heavily tied with the legitimacy gap theory, trying to rebuild that trust and reputation with stakeholders and the public, and of course, that rhetoric analysis theory. Every word was carefully selected to convey a very specific story and emotions. So, the implications from the communication efforts more broadly are that rebuilding the public's trust should be at the forefront because it is most effective. As we saw, American Airlines prioritized that, and the public had relatively few negative things to say about the response efforts. Empathy and sadness are, of course, important to convey, but must also align with competency. Being very emotional in responses can lead the public to have a lack of trust because it shows a lack of competency. And on the other hand, a lack of emotional response leaves the public very angry that the organization doesn't recognize the loss, as we see with our analysis of the Trump administration's response. I think overall this would be a good example to look at in future crisis communication efforts, especially from airlines after a crisis of this magnitude, comparing and contrasting American Airlines response efforts and the Trump administration efforts and the overall public view after. Thank you so much for listening.